You're listening to a podcast from the Edinburgh Jewish Cultural Centre in association with the Edinburgh Jewish Literary Society. This podcast features an interview with Jenni Daiches about her new novel, Somewhere Else. It was recorded at the New College Festival of Books and Belief in Edinburgh on the 7th of November 2024. There were some technical issues with the recording, but I hope you'll still enjoy listening to it.
Welcome and good afternoon. I'm Hannah Holtschneider. I'm Professor of Contemporary Jewish Cultural History here at the School of Divinity, and I'm your chair for this event. The conversation between Jenni Daiches and David Neville arises, first of all, from Jenni's wonderful new novel, Somewhere Else, and secondly, from the collaboration of a number of different groups here in Edinburgh. Of course, we've already heard about the New College Festival of Books and Belief, so wonderfully organized by Emma Wildwood and Lois Wilson-McFarland. We are also cooperating with the Edinburgh Jewish Literary Society and the Edinburgh Jewish Cultural Centre to make this event happen. And we're also collaborating with the network Edinburgh Jewish Studies here that is bringing together a range of academics working on Jewish studies and also running a number of events. So you can see a few things in this series. To many locals, David and Jenni don't need any introduction. They're well-known and established figures in Scottish, Jewish, literary and cultural life. Jenni Daiches grew up in the United States and England and has lived in Scotland since 1971. After several years as a part-time lecturer and freelance writer, in 1978 she joined what became National Museums of Scotland, where she worked in several different capacities. Since retiring from National Museums in 2001, she has returned to her previous freelance existence. As Jenni called her, she has published biography and literary and social history. She is a previous president and current trustee of the Scottish Pen, and Somewhere Else is her fourth work of fiction. David Ian Neville is an award-winning playwright, director, producer, and presenter. He's written for theatre, for television, and for radio. As an experienced theatre director, he has also produced a wide variety of dramas for BBC Radio, and he produces podcasts and live events. So without further ado, over to you, Jenni and David.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. It's a great delight and a pleasure to be with you, Jenni, and have the opportunity to talk to you about your latest novel, which I thoroughly enjoyed reading. So, Jenni, perhaps just to begin with, perhaps you could just sum up in a little bit about what the novel is about.
Well, I'll do my best. It's a novel that covers 100 years, so there's quite a lot in it. It begins in 1906 with a pogrom in Poland, in which a child of 5 survives. The rest of her family are killed, or in the case of her mother, disappears. And she's eventually adopted by an Edinburgh doctor and his wife, Max and Nora Solomon. So she grows up in Edinburgh. Almost all of her life is then spent in Edinburgh. And the novel looks at not only the life of Rosa, her daughter Esther, but the family who live next door, the Mackintosh family. And those two families are entwined, and the novel explores the lives of several generations, as I say, continuing until 2001, Rosa reaches her centenary. And in brief, that is the novel.
That is indeed the novel, and it's a fascinating read. What I'm always interested in when I read a novel or see a play or anything like that is where the germ of the idea came from.
It's a difficult question to answer, because there were several seeds, a number of things which just began to come together and to coalesce. I do draw on my own family history, and specifically, as I explain at the end of the novel, there are two uncles who, for a long time, I'd wanted to write about and sort of do justice to in some way. My maternal uncle Harry was killed in the First World War, and I have the letters that he wrote from the front. My paternal uncle Lionel, whom I'm sure there are people in this audience who have come across, he served in the Second World War. Not only did he survive, but I think he had rather a good time. And anyone who remembers Lionel will know that he was good at having a good time. So I have quoted directly from Harry's letters in the novel, and I also have the letters that Lionel wrote to his parents while he was in North Africa and Italy, and I've drawn on his letters to tell part of the story. So it was a coming together of I couldn't tell you that there was a light bulb moment when I thought, well, you know, I'm going to write a story about these people. It just gradually emerged and coalesced, and of course developed. I'm afraid I'm not the sort of person who plans everything from the start before I sit down to write. Lots of things just kind of emerged as I was writing.
But did you start with Rosa as the first character that you wanted to write?
I started with Rosa. Yes.
Rosa's the main character.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And a question, I mean, you write non-fiction and fiction. So when you've got an idea, you've got these real letters, you've got your own family history, how do you decide if it's going to be a work of fiction or a non-fiction?
It was always going to be a work of fiction.
Right.
And I won't say I'll never write another book-length piece of non-fiction, but in recent years I've just wanted to write fiction. I wanted to make things up.
Right.
It's such a liberation. It's such a liberation when you can.
And you find that that's what you talk about free writing. Do you find that you have to put in some structure and then have some days of free writing as well, or what? How does that work?
There has to be structure, and the structure is very straight. Of this novel is very straightforward because it's date and place. There aren't chapters as such. The narrative moves from one place to another, and each step is dated. There are some flashback moments, but it just progresses from 1906, when it begins, to 2001, with a bit of an exception at the very end. So that was important. I needed to do it that way just to keep my head straight, really.
Yes, because you were covering a whole century and lots of very main historical events, which we'll maybe talk about in a little while. But do you want to start with you're going to read a few extracts.
Yes.
Do you want to start with your first extract?
Yes.
Do you need to set it up in any way?
This is Rosa when she is 8 years old. She's with the family in Edinburgh. Oh, by the way, they live in Morningside Park, which is where my mother grew up. Her father is Max. Her adoptive father is Max. Her mother is Nora. Her birth father is Itzhak, and her birth mother is Rivka. And they will, in the passages that I read, they will both be mentioned. Almost every day when she comes home from school, Rosa lifts Itzhak's violin carefully from its smart case and frayed red wrapping and plucks the strings and listens hard in an effort to hear if they are in tune. She knows she must start with the A string and use the pegs to tighten or loosen each string in turn to get it right. She rubs a lump of rosin along the bow, remembering how Itzhak did it, smoothly and thoughtfully, and balancing the violin on her knee, draws the bow across the strings. She experiments with different sounds, a single note, then a higher note, and higher again. She has to press hard on the strings with her small fingertips to achieve the changes. Then she draws the bow across the D and G strings at the same time. She likes that sound so much that she saves it for last. She hears in her head the tunes her father played, and sometimes she manages an echo of a chord or a sequence that is almost what she wants. Dr. Max says to his wife that he will make inquiries about a violin teacher for their daughter. Rosa is not yet 9 years old. She has a gift, I'm sure of it. We must give her the chance to make something of it. She never speaks of her father. No, but she has his violin and she clearly wants to play it. Nora is silent for a while, then gets to her feet, takes the few steps to her husband's chair and kisses his brow. "You were right, dear," she says. "We have taken on a whole history as well as a daughter. We can't expect her to abandon that history. And if the fiddle helps her to feel closer to her father, that's a good thing." But Max says it might be better for all of us if she could forget the past. And Nora realizes that her husband is pained by her remark. How can she? It will always be with her. It's who she is. And Nora looks at Max with concern, understanding how much he wants to be a father to the child who has become theirs. And Max returns the look, knowing how much Nora is haunted by the mother who disappeared. He takes his wife's hand. "Perhaps one day she will tell us more," he says. Perhaps. She talks of her brother sometimes. She thinks he will find his way to Edinburgh. He may not know what happened to his family. And if he is doing well in Berlin, he'd be well advised to stay there. And then, as if the thought has suddenly occurred to him, he adds, he may not be alive. What should we say to her? For now, perhaps, it is best to say nothing. But Rosa does not often mention her brother. And when she does, they smile and say, yes, perhaps one day he will come. As Rosa tries to draw a remembered tune out of the violin, she tells herself a story. Dov, that's her brother, Dov will find their mother. He will take her to Hamburg, where they will get on a boat and sail to Leith. They will live in a house not far from Morningside Park. Rosa will visit Dr. Max and Nora every day, and perhaps Rivka will visit them too and become their friend. Dov will continue his studies and become a professor at the university. When she is grown up, Rosa will return to the village and visit the graves of Itzhak and Ari and tell them that Dov is a professor and she is a doctor, and that in Scotland there are no pogroms.
Thank you, Jenny. So, as you can maybe gather, the book starts off with a very traumatic experience for Rosa, who's very young. And I suppose trauma is something that is always in the background in the book. What will Rosa tell, and what will the people that she gets to know? And in some ways, I found that as a reader, that was quite interesting, because sometimes we know more about Rosa's past than the people she's with.
Yes.
And was that something you really wanted to play with and explore?
I'm not sure if that was a specific intention, but it just seemed to be a part of Rosa's character, that there's a lot that is locked up that she doesn't talk about. And of course, there's a lot that she doesn't understand and doesn't know. And she can't really talk about these things.
And I know from talking to you earlier that the question of identity is something that you wanted to explore as well. And does that also come from your own background?
Yes, I think it very much does. My background is quite mixed. My father grew up in an Orthodox Jewish household. My grandfather was a rabbi. My mother grew up in a Scottish Presbyterian household. She converted. I was born and spent part of my childhood in the United States, and then the rest of my growing up in England, but always with the understanding that home was Scotland, because that was where my parents grew up, and that was what they talked about constantly. When we go home, when we go home. And it was always Scotland. So I actually feel very privileged to have access to a number of different identities. I see it as a very positive thing. But yes, I mean, I think it's part of why I would just so much wanted to explore some of these things in this novel.
And this question of identity covers geographically where you were born, where you've lived, but also your faith or no faith in a community, and that very much comes through in the book, because you said it's about two families. I felt that it's actually about three families, because the family that Rosa left behind is always there in the consciousness. Yeah. So do you think it's just as hard navigating identity of faith as identity of nationality, for example? You've lived in America, you've lived in England, and you've lived in Scotland. And I guess this question comes up sometimes: are you Scottish? Are you Scottish-British? Or are you Scottish whatever? And again, are you Jewish, Scottish, British, or what? So where does that land? But either for your characters or for you?
Well, I think it's, I mean, as you say, it's a theme that runs through the whole book. And for each of the characters, it's a slightly different, the context is slightly different, the perception of themselves is different. I don't want to give too much away, but one of the characters, Rosa's grandson, is particularly troubled in a sense because of his mixed parentage, and makes an effort when he's still a young man, well, a teenager actually, to perhaps try and bring together his understanding of where he comes from, but fails. And there are other areas of not necessarily religious belief, but belief in causes, belief in what is the right thing to do, and these come up as well.
Yes, I realised that in doing this interview, it's very hard not to give things away about the book, you know, because there are so many great moments in the book and moments of speculation and things, there's so many characters in the book, and they all have their story, and so you're alluding to Rosa's grandson, and I guess we have to be careful not to give too much about that. But highlighting one thing about the question of faith. So Rosa is adopted by Dr. Max and his wife Nora Solomon, and in the Jewish faith it's custom to light candles on a Friday night at the start of the Sabbath, and in that household Nora lights the candles and she says the blessing, or bracha as we say, but Dr. Max doesn't believe in God. So you can just talk about their relationship and that kind of accommodation that maybe a lot of couples make.
Well, I think it is an accommodation that a lot of people make without kind of spelling it out. You recognize that your partner in life may do things differently and think things differently, and that is just the way humanity is. And if you can't adapt to that, which sadly in the world today seems to become increasingly difficult to adapt to, if you can't adapt to other people's ways of thinking and believing and feeling, then it's kind of a rather pessimistic outlook for humanity, I think.
And although that relationship seems a very good relationship, is it a confusing situation for Rosa?
That's an interesting question. I don't think so. I think she just kind of accepts what has happened to her, as small children do, because they have no agency. She doesn't choose to, first of all, be removed from the shtetl, and then this strange man who arrives from London and takes her away. And then this doctor and his wife who turn up and said, yes, we're going to have that one. And the next passage I'm going to read is a little bit about that.
Oh, right.
So children, I think, generally just kind of, that's the way things are, and they don't necessarily question.
Interesting, because she does remember in her family in the shtetl, her mother lighting candles. She relates that.
It's not totally unfamiliar to her.
Yes, and there's also that link with her father's music and playing that violin.
Yes, and the food. The food.
Of course, important. The food. Yeah, food. That's very important. Maybe talk a little bit more about the violin.
Yes.
Would you want to read your next extract?
Yes. This is 1948, so quite a lot later. Sometimes Nora lies awake at night with a shadowy figure walking through her mind, a dark, solitary figure with a shawl covering her head so she cannot see her face. Now, listening to her daughter playing Bach, she is thinking of Rosa's mother, who could, perhaps, be alive somewhere, alive more than 40 years after she vanished, after her husband and her younger son were killed, after her daughter was taken away and given to a strange family in a strange land. Who had the right to take her from the village where she was born? Who decided that this should be done? Who had the right to parcel her up and send her across the sea? And who had the right to present themselves at the children's home and say, yes, we'll have her, that one, the beautiful child with deep dark eyes and the light brown hair falling to her shoulders, the child who now was still beautiful and playing Bach on her father's violin, a wife with a grown child of her own, though one not fathered by her husband. The music stops. There is silence for several minutes, then the familiar chromatics of klezmer begin. Nora smiles. She tells herself, as she has told herself often, that it is too late to imagine a different story. Oscar is Rosa's husband. Oscar, reading the Sunday paper in the front room, also hears the change of tune. There is a great deal he does not know about his wife. They each have histories too intricate to reduce to a simple narrative. They do not speak of the love they have felt for others, the love they still feel for people who have gone. He puts the paper down. His eyes trouble him if he spends too long with newsprint, and there are times when English tires him. He listens to the music of Rosa Roshkin, he, a Pole from Krakow, who as a child was not allowed to go near Kazimierz, the Jewish quarter, whose mother would cross the street rather than encounter a foreign-looking person on a crowded pavement. That evening, they turn on the radio. The United Nations General Assembly is meeting at its temporary headquarters at Lake Success on Long Island. They have voted to approve the partition of Palestine.
Thank you. So I think from that extract you can begin to see the scope of the book and how it moves through the 20th century, and such important events happen. One of the things I like about the book is that, you know, you cover the First World War, Second World War, the Spanish Civil War, and then, of course, the United Nations decision to partition Palestine. But what's interesting, I think, is you don't major on these events. They happen in people's lives rather than that's the main focus of the book. And you subtly introduce them. And that brings me to the other family, the Macintoshes, who live, if I get this right, at 17 Morningside Park. Is that right?
Yes.
And and the Solomons live at 19. So they're next door neighbours. And you also tell that family's story. They have two sons who are both in different ways involved in the First and Second War. And so trauma affects both families. And what's interesting is that Rosa gets to know both boys when she's very young, and they become friends. And although the Solomons and the Macintoshes are, I would say, good neighbours, there's a gap between them, would you say?
There is a gap between them. I think, particularly the older generation, Hector Mackintosh, who's a journalist on an invented Scottish newspaper, and his wife, who has, I don't want to over-explain, his wife has got Gaelic connections, and they become, the two women, Nora and Mrs. Mackintosh, become quite good friends. But Hector Mackintosh is clearly has reservations about the relationship.
Yes, and that's interesting because I think in Scotland we like to think that we're very open and welcoming, but one of the things that again you do quite subtly is you show that in Edinburgh these new immigrants at the early part of the 20th century are still seen as outsiders. And that's a very interesting thing. You talk about that. Is that something that in your family has been experienced?
Yes. I think it would be quite, there must be examples of Jewish families who grow up perhaps in specifically Jewish communities and in a Jewish context who don't feel like outsiders. But isn't it something that just comes with the territory, as it were? An awareness that you're not quite like the others.
Yes.
And the others' awareness that you are not quite like them.
Yes. And I suppose, particularly at the late 19th century or the 20th century, when people came from abroad, they perhaps dressed differently, but also spoke differently. They would have an accent. So that was quite clear that they were immigrants or refugees.
Yes.
Yeah. But at a child level, Rosa and the boys next door just get on, don't they?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And well, again, I don't want to give too much away, but they do become very close.
They do become close. But even later on in that relationship, there is just a little undercurrent somewhere, which read the book and you'll see what it is. I think it's very interesting. Let's talk about covering these big events, the First World War and the Second World War. Tell me a bit more about the letters, the real letters that you had.
Well, my Uncle Harry's letters are written from when he first, the story in the family was that he lied about his age to join up. And the initial letters are about his training, and he joins the Gordon Highlanders, but then decides he wants to go into the Royal Flying Corps. So, and his letters are fascinating because they are, I mean, obviously he's partly writing what he thinks his parents want to hear. And also when he's writing later from the front, his letters are censored. So he knew there are things that he simply could not write about. But his letters are so gung-ho. His descriptions of flying for the first time, his descriptions of shooting down enemy planes, and it's so full of, enthusiasm, and then of course, his plane gets shot down and he doesn't survive. But it's really interesting. And I also have the letter written by I have the telegram that the family received, and the letter written by his commanding officer saying, oh, he died a hero, he was wonderful, etc. And you find yourself thinking, how many letters like that did officers have to write about? So that was Harry. And I grew up, my mother told me about Harry. He was a lot older than my mother. But he was her big brother, and she was quite young when he died. And then my Uncle Lionel's letters, again, there, one of the things he writes about a lot is food, because if he was writing to his family, who of course there was rationing and all of that, and he was in North Africa and even in Italy, where he encountered extreme suffering and poverty. There seemed to be endless amounts of food, which he writes about with great enthusiasm. But they're fascinating because I have almost a complete series of over 100 letters, and they just chronicle his whole experience from arriving in North Africa and then later on moving on to Italy and following the troops as they gradually push north.
And so you actually use some of Harry's letters in the book?
I quote directly from Harry's letters. I use Lionel's letters, but I don't quote directly from them.
Yes, yeah. Well, they sound very authentic, I have to say. Because I think that's one of the hard things. There's lots of hard things about writing, but writing some letters, like from a war zone or something like that, it's very, very difficult to get authentically correct, I think. And both sets of letters, I was going through the book thinking, are they real letters, or are they based on real letters? And then at the very end of the book, in the postscript, you tell us where they came from. So obviously in this book it covers a long time span, but you have lots and lots of characters in the book. So a writing question: how do you keep track of all your characters?
Sometimes with difficulty. Sometimes I didn't find it difficult to keep track of the characters as people, but keeping track of, now, hang on a minute, how old was Yossi at that particular, when he was doing whatever it was? But that's where the structure of the book, where I had dates at every division, that sort of helped to keep me right, as well as I hope making it reasonably straightforward for the reader.
Mm-hmm. But with all these characters and so many fascinating characters, how did you decide which story to focus on? Obviously you've got your main story, the main drive of the novel, but you also tell us subsidiary stories, really. Is that very difficult to navigate?
I think the stories just emerged as the characters developed. I began to see what direction their lives were going to go in. And as I said earlier, I'm not very good at planning everything. I know there are people who sit down, everything is mapped out, and they know exactly where they're going. I knew how the book was going to end, and I knew how it was going to begin, but a lot of what happened in the middle I didn't know until I was actually writing. And then when you, as a writer, when you start to get to grips with a character and see how they're developing and they're growing and their interests are developing, you think, oh yes, I think she's going to become a poet. And then, much will follow from that.
Yes, that's a little giveaway, isn't it? One of your characters. Yeah, and that's really interesting, that whole journey of the two families and how the families go and develop over the generations. And Rosa is there for the duration, isn't she?
Yes.
She has a long life. So, yeah, very interesting. Jenni, it's been fascinating to talk to you this evening, and thank you for sharing your time talking to us about your new book.
Well, thank you, David. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and it's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this podcast from the Edinburgh Jewish Cultural Centre in association with the Edinburgh Jewish Literary Society. If you want to sign up to the Cultural Centre's newsletter and keep up with events online and live, go to our website at www.jcc.scot. If you'd like to know more about the Edinburgh Jewish Literary Society, go to ejls.org.